The Roman Catholic Church has a new pope. There is a new bishop of Rome. And a number of people have asked me to give my thoughts on this. And, in some ways I'm like, why would you want me to give my thoughts on this? I'm a Lutheran, not a Roman Catholic. But I will give my thoughts on this because people have asked for it. And so I have a few things that I just want to say. Now, who is this new pope? His name is Robert Francis Prevost. He is from Chicago, though he did a lot of missionary work in Peru, and he attended St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome to get his doctorate in canon law. And a lot of people have talked about this, that this is the first American pope, so that's kind of an interesting development, certainly, as an American myself. And he has taken the name upon himself, Pope Leo XIV. Now, a lot of attention has been paid to the picking of that particular name. And when a pope picks a name, that is pretty intentional, right? So Pope Francis took the name Francis clearly because he held to what he saw as the ideals of St. Francis in terms of his care for the poor and those kinds of issues. And so, the question is, well, why is it that he took the name Leo XIV? Leo is one of the most common names among popes. There are many Leos, and this goes all the way back to Pope Leo I, who was the Bishop of Rome, who was influential in the Chalcedonian definition, the definition of the two natures of Christ that was adopted by the really universal church by and large. And so there's a text that he wrote called Leo's Tome, which was highly influential there. He also was known for his bravery in standing up to the barbarians that were coming to sack Rome and for his protection of the churches there. So because of that, because of Leo's influence, which again is a universal influence really over the whole church, people have often taken the name Leo. Now, as a Lutheran, when I think of Leo, of course, I think of Pope Leo X, who was the pope who excommunicated Martin Luther. So I don't have quite as positive a view of Leo X, either of his moral life or his theology, that I do of Leo I. And the popes are of varying qualities throughout the centuries, I'll just say. Pope Leo IX also was the pope that preceded Leo X, was the one who formally excommunicated the Eastern Church. And so there have been two Leos that have been, really the ones in office when there were two pretty significant splits in the church. But really, I think the name Leo XIV is really going back to Leo XIII. Leo XIII was the pope following Pope Pius IX. Pope Pius IX oversaw the First Vatican Council in 1870. And so Pope Pius XIII was the pope who kind of brought Rome into the modern era. And he really had to reckon with a kind of new social situation in the world and a lot of modern issues that popes in the past hadn't really had to deal with. Everybody's wrestling with the changing landscape of the Western world in the 20th century. And so he's the pope that leads the Roman Church into the 20th century. And he's known for a few things. And from my perspective, some of those good and some of those bad. So one of those things is that he revives the theology of Thomas Aquinas and the theology of St. Augustine. This is a very positive thing, in my view, certainly. Any kind of move toward an Augustinian theology is going to be one that is going to be much more congenial to a lot of certainly Protestant Reformation concerns. As a Lutheran, of course, our own Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Augustine helped to form many of his ideas. And Augustine was so influential upon all of the reformers, from the Lutherans and the Reformed and the Anglicans as well. So he brought back this kind of focus on more Thomistic and Augustinian theology. He also promoted a deep Marian piety. Of course, that's something that I am not as particularly fond of, not the kind of Marian piety in its more extreme forms as it appears in parts of the Roman tradition. And another element, though, of his teaching is that he started to emphasize care for the poor in a social sense. When people talk about Catholic social teaching, which is both in opposition to a very kind of strong individualistic type of capitalism, at least, of the kind of Adam Smith variety, as well as opposed to socialism and Marxism. There's kind of a middle way that was promoted by Leo XIII. And so most likely the elements of Leo XIII's reign as a pope that are being evoked here with this choosing of the name Leo XIV are probably mostly related to that social element. However, this new pope is also an Augustinian. So he is from the Augustinian order, the first pope ever from the Augustinian order. That's a very positive thing. I certainly think so. And he has, just going through his Twitter, and people have done this, they've gone through all of the old tweets. He doesn't tweet very much. And at one point, he tweeted a really great quote from St. Augustine about how we are not saved by our good works, but by grace through faith. And it didn't say faith alone, but certainly it was good to see that there are some of those concerns that are being raised, the primacy of grace, the primacy of faith, and those kinds of things that certainly as a Lutheran, I'm oriented toward those things. I think those are really essential. So that's all very positive. I think it does seem apparent that he also is a promoter of Marian piety, which again, there's going to be some hesitance there on those things. And so there are a lot of questions now, people asking, is he going to continue the Francis's pontificate? Is this going to basically be a new version of Pope Francis, somebody who is more progressive on his social teachings, less clear on the traditions of the church, less clear on doctrine? And there are certain things that have been said in the past that have led people to that kind of conclusion that this is really just going to be a continuation of Francis's pontificate. I don't really think that that's the case. Some of this really even just comes from the fact that, I don't know, James Martin said something nice about him, and that he said something against J.D. Vance and what J.D. Vance said about the Ordo Amoris. Totally different topic for another video. And I don't think that's, from all that I've read, and I don't know that much, right? So what do I know? I'm trying to put the pieces together here as best I can, right? But as far as I can tell, I have seen evidences that he seems to be rather traditional in some very important ways on various moral issues. There's a kind of traditionalism that seems quite apparent in even the vestments that he was wearing that were different from what Francis wore. And so there does seem to be certainly more of a traditionalism probably there than you would find in Francis. There's something I've seen, I don't know the validity of this, of his presiding over Latin masses at different points. So it seems to me, from what I can tell, he's probably kind of a moderate within Rome. This seems somewhat evident that this would have to be the case because his election was pretty quick and seemingly quite universal. The church is quite divided right now between your kind of traditionalist and your more progressive branches within Rome. And so I thought it was kind of inevitable in many ways that a moderate was going to fill this position right now, because if you get somebody who's kind of extreme on either of those directions, it's going to further foment divisions that Francis has continued to kind of inflame in his pontificate. I think something that's going to be very positive about this is Francis was very unclear all the time. And this was evident because every time Francis seems like made a public statement and said something kind of wild, you had a lot of people, both at the Vatican and public defenders of the Roman Catholic Church, having to reinterpret what Francis actually meant by the thing that he said, because what he said was not really very orthodox. And the good thing I think about this current Pope, Leo XIV, is that he has a doctorate in canon law. And one of the things that I have read from a number of people that know him is they're talking about his clarity and his intelligence. And I think the benefit of that is that I think you're going to see a lot more precision and clarity in terms of the language that's used and the things that are said. And so whatever perspective he might take on issues, I don't think we're going to be left with the kind of constant confusion that seemed to characterize Francis's pontificate, where he just kind of said stuff. I think there's going to be more precision. So that's always a good thing for anybody who's in a public space. So you at least know what he's really trying to say. So you're not having to guess. And so he does seem, as far as I could tell, pretty well educated theologically, especially in the writing of St. Augustine. Though I do have some questions about his understanding of Augustine's doctrine of love because of what he said about J.D. Vance. So there's some questions there, but of course, it's a tweet, and what can you do from a tweet? As I know from my own Twitter, tweets are not always very precise. In fact, they are never precise because that's the nature of the platform. So then I get this question that people have asked me, just because I made a few brief comments on Twitter about the new Pope and just kind of my thoughts. And, the question was, why do you even care? Like, you're not even part of the Roman Church, so who cares? And we just shouldn't pay any attention at all to what's going on in the Roman Church. And I just think that that's not really a helpful way to view the church in general. Just because I am not part of the Roman Church, because I certainly don't uphold the dogmas of the papacy. I don't believe that the Pope was a divinely instituted office that was necessary to lead and guide the church. I certainly don't buy into the claims of Vatican I. So I don't have a theological commitment to the Bishop of Rome in the way that Rome does. But nonetheless, I do care about the universal church. And I do think that it's important for the church to seek unity where it is possible. And this is Jesus' prayer in John 17. Jesus does pray that the church might be one. He prays for unity, the unity of his people. And that prayer of Jesus really became the cornerstone of the ecumenical movement in the 20th century. Now, so I think that an ecumenical outlook, in terms of one that recognizes the universality of the church, is one that every Christian should have, which means that we should be concerned with and we should care about what's happening in the church universal. Now, you can't pay attention to everything, and not everybody's meant to pay attention to everything, but in my position, I'm a public theologian, and that's what I do. So because of my public theology, I'm engaged in dialogues, I'm engaged in debates, I'm engaged in dealing with people in other traditions. I care a lot about what's going on in the world of confessional Presbyterianism. I care a lot about what's going on in the world of Rome and what's going on among my, Anglican Church in North America brothers and sisters. Like these are all we're all part of the church. And so, yes, I'm very concerned with what's going on there. Not that I need to know all the little details about divisions and gossip and that kind of stuff, but I think that someone, especially who's in a public position, should have a desire to communicate with other Christians. Now, with that being said, there are good kinds of ecumenical dialogue and there are bad kinds of ecumenical dialogue. And the negative kinds of ecumenical dialogue are ones where the differences between traditions are just ignored. And those kind of things I don't think are helpful. And this is the kind of thing that you might get when you have somebody like Francis. I mean, Francis made claims about the Lutheran doctrine of justification, where he said, we all agreed on that because we had the joint declaration on justification. There's no difference at all there anymore. And that's just not really a fair understanding of I think, the results of those dialogues on justification. Now, to be clear, there are many points of alignment between our traditions on the doctrine of justification. And that was shown through the joint declaration. But the joint declaration also didn't really acknowledge what are some really important differences that still remain too. So I think good ecumenical dialogue is dialogue where people can admit where they really disagree and be really open and honest with each other. And so good ecumenical dialogue is dialogue where somebody can say, look, I know you're a brother in Christ, but I think you're very wrong. And here's why. Because you're never going to get anywhere in a discussion where you're just hiding differences or just pretending they don't exist. And so I made the comment about the new Pope is that I really was hoping for a moderate. And in general, that's what I hope for the papacy, because I want a couple things. Again, I'm not Roman Catholic, so you don't have to listen to what I want. It's like the ultimate point, but people asked. So one is I want someone who is authentically Roman, right? I want somebody who's authentic with their tradition, who is not going to just kind of ignore differences and pretend that all religions are the same, or kind of ignore the realities of judgment, or ignore traditional sexual ethics and morality. That kind of hope is squishy and meaningless and doesn't do anybody any good. And I don't want Rome to fall into the same kinds of things that we have with mainline liberal Protestantism that hardly believes anything. I don't want that for Rome, not because I am in Rome or think they're necessarily right, but I want them to preserve orthodoxy as far as they can. So, somebody has to be orthodox enough that you can actually have a discussion. I want that. I want them to be faithful to the authority of Scripture. Even obviously, they believe different things about how Scripture relates to tradition and those kind of things. But I would like a pope who's clear on the historicity of the events in the life of Jesus and his resurrection, and on, again, marriage and life and all of those kinds of things. But I also desire that the leadership would be ecumenical enough to still recognize the need for continued dialogue and hashing out of issues. And that I think is always a good thing, because when you get those who are kind of the ultra-traditionalists in Rome, who really want to, I don't know, downplay Vatican II, or not just maybe downplay Vatican II, but really don't want Vatican II to be an authoritative council of any kind, but have to. So they have to recognize it unless they want to be a sedevacantist. And Vatican II obviously opened up very different ways of looking at Protestants. We're referred to as, separated brethren and things like that. So what that does is it changes the direction of the discussion. So it's not a matter of saying, you're not a Christian, I am a Christian, this is a pretty serious issue, let's hash it out, to we're in the same family of God, but we have very serious theological disagreements. These aren't minimal things, but we need to hash them out. You can only do that with honesty instead of ignoring, your differences. So that's the kind of thing that I really want to see from what I can see in this Pope. Obviously, we'll see. We'll see where things go, but it seems like that might be the direction that the church is going. So again, I care about clarity, enough clarity that you can actually be honest about the issues that you have, but also a desire to not just depart from traditional Christian teaching on either theology or ethics. So, people make these comments when I say things about ecumenical dialogues, or I say things about, how I'm watching these kinds of events. People often say, I'm just headed to Rome or something like that, or compromising. And that's not true at all. There's no desire in me whatsoever to become Roman. And the reason is pretty simple. I don't find the claims of the papacy compelling. I don't find them compelling historically. I don't find them compelling theologically. I don't find them compelling exegetically. And so in order to be Roman, I would have to be convinced by those things. And the more I study history, the more I study theology, the more I read Roman Catholic theologians, the less convinced I am, or rather, the more firm I am in my commitment that I just don't think that the papacy is the office that it claims to be. I don't believe that it was founded by Christ in the sense that Rome claims. So I'm not going to Rome. I'm not minimizing the differences. But you can both be bold in your own confessionalism, and bold in things like guarding your own altar, and bold in proclaiming your distinctions and what you think is important, while at the same time also desiring unity where it can be had. And that means that we need to continue to hash out our issues. And we need to continue to work through these things as best we can, to clarify where there are misconceptions, to talk about where things have changed maybe. And this is, I think, one of the issues that I see in a lot of especially Reformed responses to the current Pope. Just a lot of the initial responses are, well, the Pope is Antichrist, and then they start to quote things that Pope Leo X said. It's almost as if some Protestants want Rome to be what it was in the 16th century. Like they want to have the fight as it was in the 16th century. The reality is Rome today is not the 16th century Rome. It's just not. And yes, they still hold officially to all of the dogmatic statements of Trent, but things have been reinterpreted and changed, and, to use Newman's language, they've developed. So Rome isn't the same as it was then. It's just not. And I think it is, first of all, I think it's ignorant and naive to assume that it's exactly the same as it was then. But also, it seems to be a very cynical attitude to say, well, I won't even try, right? We won't even try to have these conversations. I won't even try to ever dialogue with them in any possible way. They're just doomed to be the church of the 16th century condemning Luther forever, and that's it, end of story. I don't think that's just not a fair reading. And then one final thing I wanted to address, because people ask this, is what about the claims about the Pope that we have in our Lutheran confessions, the power and primacy of the Pope, where there are statements in the Lutheran confessions that say the Pope is Antichrist. There have been, some questions of, well, how can you speak in any way positive of the Pope? This is especially true with Benedict XVI, which, honestly, a lot of Lutherans like Benedict XVI, because he, I think, actually understood Luther pretty well. He was sympathetic to a significant degree to some of Luther's concerns. I'm not saying he was a Lutheran by any means. And he wrote some good things about the life of Jesus. And so The question is, can you say anything good about the Pope at all, of any Pope? Or is the office inherently antichrist forever? What are we bound by in Lutheran confessional tradition? And I think it's worth noting that Melanchthon said that, in the Confessions, as he signs his name, he says that he's willing to submit to the Bishop of Rome as the Bishop of Rome if he ceases making the absolute claims about himself, about his office being of absolute necessity and divine authority. It's one thing to say that there is one bishop who is who has primacy through human right and tradition. It's a very different thing to say it's of necessity of the essence of the church. The former there was no issue with, for Melanchthon at least, but the latter there was. So even in Melanchthon's attitude in the Confessions themselves, there was an openness to the possibility that this could change. That though what the papacy was in the 16th century was, as he says, Antichrist, this doesn't mean that it has to be that way in perpetuity. There is a possibility of change. And so when we're talking about this harsh language, I think it was rightly harsh language to talk about Pope Leo X and many of the medieval popes. So there was a vast wickedness among many medieval popes. And Roman historians acknowledge that too. So it's not like that's just our claim. And there are people who abuse the office, make audacious claims about themselves, engage in all sorts of promiscuity and abuse and corruption of any kind you could imagine. And so, yes, the papacy was referred to in that way. The question is that definitive for the rest of the history of the church, that that's the case? And I don't think our confessions bind us to that position, because it pretty evidently wasn't Melanchthon's position, because we see his openness to there being a change in Rome. And so the question is then left open of how we view the office of the papacy today. So there's some variation there. And certainly I wouldn't say that the Bishop of Rome is my bishop. He's not. He has no authority over me. I don't think he has divinely granted authority over me. But nonetheless, he is the chief bishop of a very large group of Christians, the largest group of Christians in the world. And so what happens there, I think, is relevant to all of us. And I think Christians of all types should care about what happens in the broader church. And we should seek, again, honest dialogue and debate, even very heated debate, as is necessary. So speaking of that, I recently did a conference with 3 Dominicans and 2 other Lutheran theologians on the issue of virtue in our respective traditions. And those Roman Catholic theologians came from Rome, actually the same university where the current Pope studied to do his doctorate. And so excited to put those out there. They're going to be up next month during June. So if you want to see what I think is a fruitful dialogue, dialogue I think that's honest, and we're not conceding, our views of various issues in our traditions, but we are having a good, open discussion about things that really matter, and points we agree and points where we disagree. And I think that that's the kind of thing that I like to be involved in. That's the kind of thing I would love to see happen more. So thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you do. And let me know your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video. God bless.